So let's talk about the ridiculous antics of 40k's new drop scions, and why the Tempestus Aquilons are one of the single strongest units in the entirety of 40k right now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Imperial Guard. In this video I thought we'd cycle back to talk about the Tempestus Aquilons once more, and given they're perhaps one of the currently scariest things in Warhammer 40k at the moment, do a little bit more of a deep dive into their datasheet, their vast amount of options for what to do with them, and a few thoughts as to countering them in game. I did talk about these a little bit when their datasheet dropped, along with Kill Team Hivestorm, but after people have had a fair amount of time to experiment with them, they've been slotting into all sorts of army lists, and I've played a good number of games with them myself. I thought they deserved a second look due to just how many disturbing things they can do. In game, the Tempestus Aquilons are basically the new Kill Team drop troops, pretty much Scion models with grav chutes on the back with those big twin thrusters, plus coming with a fun sentry gun, a bunch of cool options to assemble some of the models as specialists for some good looks, some fairly dynamic poses of them alighting from the skies, and some nice carbine style hotshot lasguns for a slightly different look to their Militarum Tempestus brothers. Generally the models were quite well received. They came out in the Kill Team Hivestorm box set. They're still waiting for an individual release currently, so best bet to pick them up is either to get them second hand, which they can be going for some slightly crazy prices for some of them at the moment, even if there were quite a lot of Hivestorm box sets sold, or potentially convert your own out of some Scions and some third-party jump packs. As mentioned, they've certainly been an enormous boon of strength to add into the Astra Militarum, receiving a 40k datasheet and a 90-point cost, and I'd argue might be one of the single strongest datasheets to add to an army at the moment, genuinely up there with some of the very strongest stuff in Warhammer 40k. In any case, let's do a quick roundup of the datasheet once more, and then go through a whole bunch of their really big options with which they can score points or deal damage, and what it's meant for guard army lists. First up, starting with their basic stats, they're 90 points for a unit of 10 essentially Scion stat line models, toughness 3 with a 4+ save, and objective control 1. Their sentry gun doesn't count as an additional model in terms of being able to tank damage or things, it's just a war gear option for the sergeant technically, so it's a bit of a counter in a similar way to Tau drones. As with the Kazakin, you have to take them as a unit of 10, you can't take them in 5s like the Militarum Tempestus Scions, perhaps kind of expected given some past trends with kill team kits such as the Commandos or the Kazakin. Ordinarily that might not be the single best news for them, and perhaps push them into more of a damage dealer role than an objective support kind of role, but when they have a 3-inch deep strike, plus some pretty punchy anti-infantry shooting, they're good enough to be both at the moment. Otherwise for keywords and things, they have both the grenades and the smoke keyword. Grenades is definitely helpful for a bit of extra damage, and smoke could be nice enough to help them try and survive if you need to get cover on them. A 4+ saving cover will at least take a bit of volume fire to chew through. And they also get the regiment keyword, so you get all the synergies that brings, such as born soldiers and reinforcements and a few other bits. Their big rule is that they're one of the infamous 3-inch drop units of 10th edition 40k, a capability that at least a fair few armies have access to in one form or another now. And the upshot of that is usually that they're going to drop somewhere pretty close and pretty effective on the tabletop. It is possible to screen out 3-inch deep strikes, but if you want to deny them drop zones, then you're going to need quite a lot of units fairly strung out on the table, and it might have other downsides with, say, those units not being able to go and do objectives or deal damage quite as efficiently, or have them chained out in such a way that you can draw lines of sight to them, which might not be great either. Getting 3-inch deep strike on an otherwise fairly efficient 90-point unit is a really big deal, basically making them the Inceptors of the Astra Militarum. And I'd argue that in terms of their squad's damage and defense, they're at least kind of comparable with, say, Bolter Inceptors against certain targets, and those things were absolutely auto-include when they were 115 points, and the Aquilons are just 90, which certainly pushes them into absolute auto-include territory in my mind, and I'd most certainly be tempted to take more than one squad. I'll talk more about the 3-inch drop in just a second, but it can do things like dealing damage against things that should be safe, guaranteeing that you get certain secondaries that need you to be in a certain place on the board, or maybe swiping primary objectives if the opponent isn't directly on them. They can still deal all their shooting damage unless they're doing an action or something like that to rustle up some victory points, and as per normal you're not allowed to declare a charge after the 3-inch drop. That's very standard, as it would make them even more crazy. I feel like what's kind of impressive though is their damage output isn't even bad. Between the servo sentry and the squad's mainline war gear, they can spit out a serious amount of hurt against anything that isn't either a monster or vehicle, to the point where even if you have no secondary options or don't have any way to use that 3-inch deep strike for particularly clever or nefarious means, they're still not going to be super wasted clearing out a bunch of chaff or putting a hit on a lone operative or an isolated character or something. Most of them get hotshot las carbines. You get 8 in total in the unit, as the Tempestor can still take one. So that's 16 shots at strength 3, AP 1, damage 1, all out to 18 inches, and have the assault keyword if you need it, and lethal hits against anything that's not a monster or vehicle. Then for special weapons, it makes sense to upgrade one of them to a long las. That's a single shot at strength 4, AP 2 and damage 3 with heavy and precision. Slightly better than the standard strength 3 AP 1 I think, and gives you an okay chance to one-shot a Space Marine. And then I've seen people both using either the melter carbine or the plasma carbine, either 2 plasma shots or 1 melter shot. The melter shot does have the advantage that you can drop within its 5-inch half range and get the d6 plus 2 damage if one shot does go through. Also, one can take 2 pistols if desired, which maybe has a small advantage in that you can fire them in melee and you still get the 2 shots out to 12-inch range otherwise. Then, and perhaps one of the single most impressive things about the squad's damage is the servo sentry. This can either take a double grenade launcher, double hotshot volley gun, or a sentry flamer. They've basically got the profiles of pretty much 2 attacks strapped together. So the flamer gets d6 plus 3 attacks rather than just d6, and the grenade launcher gets 2 shots with its crack mode, though it does hit on a 4, not a 3. Due to hitting on a 4+, it seems that people basically always take the sentry flamer, as it just synergizes really well with the squad's damage to clear out lighter infantry, particularly as it ignores cover, doesn't need to roll to hit on a 4+, and can be good for Overwatch as well. I feel like the other options aren't terrible, but I can see why people play the flamer. In addition to that, you also get to make a single attack with that servo sentry when the squad comes in via deep strike, so you basically get to make an attack with that both in the movement phase and in the shooting phase. So for the flamer alone, that means that you average around about 13 strength 4 AP 0 damage 1 hits, ignoring cover, which is kind of mad just for the sort of upgrade model, never mind the mainline hotshot damage. The numbers do seem to make sense to justify the flamer to me. 13 hits like that I think outweighs 2 hits at strength 9 AP 2 and damage D3, at least for the role that they're likely to be doing, even if those higher strength attacks could be a bit better at killing some heavy infantry or something. The servo sentry attacking when it drops in could also potentially have shenanigans for things like rapid ingress as well, for just a tiny bit of weird out of phase damage that could be kind of crucial very situationally. Otherwise, though, it kind of makes sense to just give the Tempestus Aquilons the hotshot las carbine, I suppose, though you could trade it out for a hotshot pistol and a power weapon if you wanted just a tiny bit of melee threat in the squad. Putting that all together for the damage output of the squad, for this loadout I've gone with the hotshot las guns, the plasma carbine, the sentry flamer, and the long las. And putting that all together, completely unbuffed by other things, and just using the Born Soldiers lethal hits, on average the squad takes down around about 13 termagants or guardsmen equivalents, so some pretty good odds to remove something like a backfield objective grabber type unit. The lethal hits make them unusually good against anything with low saves but high toughness, so the squad would kill around about 7 or 8 orc boys, again very nearly just taking out their entire points cost worth of enemy models, which is just massive given how hard it is to screen these guys, and they're almost always going to be getting the first strike. And even against sort of medium infantry, they'd kill around about 3 or 4 Space Marines on average. Again, that'd be a solid chunk of the points that you paid for the Aquilons, and if you budgeted for a grenade stratagem, they'd have at least a fairly reasonable chance to wipe out a 5-man Space Marine squad that might be taking or holding an objective. At the very least, it feels like you deplete them to the point where they're not going to be wiping out the entire Aquilon squad in return. Against tougher stuff, they are a fair bit more underwhelming. They only average around about 1 slain Terminator and aren't going to do very much to monsters and vehicles and things. But if the opponent has any light infantry at all, then these guys feel like they can soundly delete a very good number of them. Basically, they have a very reasonable chance to kill their points back despite having little chance to screen them, and pretty godly objective power, scoring primaries and secondaries. They just basically feel like one of the very easiest units to use in Warhammer 40k at the moment. There's almost no way to go wrong with them. Cool to force your opponents to do all sorts of weird things to try and counter them, and often might be able to either take or deny a bunch of victory points, or wipe out something incredibly important. It doesn't necessarily end there though on the drop, as well as the grenade stratagem that you can use out of deep strike. Overwatch is really big for them as well. This is due to the guard lethal hits, which didn't used to happen in the enemy turn, but after they changed it in the balanced data slate, they now do. It means that if they overwatch against anything that isn't a monster or vehicle, all their regular weapons get 6s will auto-wound. Of course, the flame is a pretty nasty threat in its own right, even if it's only firing once. If you're targeting a unit that doesn't have a cover save, you'd kill around about 5 or 6 guardsmen equivalent on average. I could certainly cut down a whole bunch of a unit that was just stepping up to try and deal with them in return, or do around about 3 wounds to Space Marine equivalents. Again, a pretty good chance to maybe finish off a squad that didn't quite die to the initial strike, if it makes sense to. Just in general though, having some Overwatch that'll pretty reliably put out some solid damage against enemy infantry that could just be deployed right in the heart of their army could be really disruptive, particularly if you destroy a bunch of things that were just about to deal their own damage in some way. Then for stratagems that have particularly good value for them, I feel like they're now arguably one of the single strongest units in the Guard army for the reinforcement stratagem. That's the 2 command point one that you target a regimental unit for, and you put it back into reserve at full strength once it was slain, though you can only use it once per game, so you might deny the opportunity to something else like a whole bunch of 20 infantry or a big unit of sentinels if you had one. I feel like arguably they could easily be one of the single best value units to use it on though. Particularly say if you had an Aquilon unit slain in turn 3. It means that you could have a unit that could drop down later in the game and do a 3-inch deep strike to pretty much guarantee more secondary objectives, or again have yet more threats to drop down and kill units on far-flung points when the main thing that matters is scoring points. I guess in theory 2 command points for 90 points worth of Aquilons isn't as much as say Sentinels, but in reality I think the unit's worth far more than 90 points, so it's not exactly a reliable measure. And given that Guard usually tend to have a slight overabundance of command points between Lord Solar Leontus and broadly some slightly mediocre stratagems out of their options, I feel like it's not the hardest thing in the world to be able to have 2 on hand to resurrect the unit when it matters. It also puts the opponent in a bit of an annoying situation, as they'd have to weigh up whether or not they actually want to try and wipe out the Aquilons, or maybe just try and deal a bunch of damage to them or tie them up or something. That could certainly be one way to stop them doing a full reinforcement annoyance thing, but also is likely going to be taking another unit out of the game to tie them up and irritate them, or leaving a random unit just hovering around the backfield, which might be able to do annoying things like, say, do some secondary objectives and actions and things, or throw grenades around, if they haven't locked them up in close combat. Cycling back to the really good bit though with the 3-inch drop, each time you have the option to use it, they've just got so many choices for a 90 point somewhat expendable unit. As mentioned, perhaps the biggest and most obvious direct thing is to be able to drop behind enemy lines to do certain secondaries, obviously the actual named behind enemy lines one, but also things like establish locus, or perhaps doing things like sabotage if there's a good position where they're going to guarantee that they can't get wiped out, or of course other ones that might be slightly lower yield, maybe things like engage on all fronts, but still if they can manage to drop that, get some victory points and wipe out some crucial enemy units, then they're going to have enough value overall. Otherwise they can just put their good damage on something critical, such as home field objective grabbers, say wipe out a unit of Gretchen and force something far bigger and scarier to return to the home field to hold the point if the Orc player still wants to score it, and the same for a bunch of equivalents of other armies out there, perhaps hitting lone operatives that would otherwise be super safe, or just about any other target of opportunity, perhaps some valuable 1 wound but high value Eldari Aspect Warriors, or Drukari Incubi or something. Or even occasionally it might make sense to put the finishing touch on an enemy vehicle. Say you had something that was like 3 wounds left for a really big scary gun tank that you couldn't threaten otherwise, dropping them in, throwing a grenade and praying for a bit of damage from their squad should have a pretty reasonable chance of taking the thing down, if otherwise it's going to clap back for a whole bunch of damage in the next turn. They can also have great value for primary objectives as well, if the opponent was just towing onto them with one unit that's trying to stay safe behind cover maybe. There might be enough room to 3-inch drop them literally onto that primary and take it off them then and there. It's not often that you can do that with deep strike units without a risky 9-inch charge, and otherwise while they're going around doing some of the above, they might be able to do a bit of crafty move blocking as well. Say if your opponent has got some big scary melee threats they want to be moving up the board, dropping a thin line of Tempestus Aquilons in front of a whole bunch of them could be hugely annoying, basically meaning that they can move 2-inch forwards without getting into engagement range, maybe charge them after that, but you might have made some seriously important units only move 3 inches next turn and keep them out of the game entirely for an extra turn or so, where they might have been wanting to break your objective holders on the midfield perhaps. I think in general with the utility that you can get from dropping them in your own turn, it probably doesn't usually make sense to rapid ingress them, but just every so often they could do some craziness with that as well. Say if your opponent just had melee units and not a whole bunch of shooting, you could rapid ingress them to block a key charge. They can use their 3-inch drop for that, given that they're set up by deep strike. Say just for one example, you might have an Avatar of Cain lining up a somewhat easy charge on a tank commander in the midboard. Say they've got a 7-inch charge on it, and what's likely to happen is the Avatar charges that, kills the tank commander, and takes the objective off you. Rapid ingressing some Aquilons to screen out that charge could mean that both your tank commander survives, and the Eldari aren't able to take the primary objective off you, so you get to score that as well. Between those two huge swings, that could be enough to justify the entire sacrifice of a valuable unit. or otherwise you could use them to swipe and score primaries, say perhaps a far-flung objective markers held just by one lonely enemy troop. Again, the 3-inch drop could be enough to tow onto that objective if they can stay safe from enemy shooting or charges that same turn. It could mean that they could hold the objective and score you victory points when it gets to your command phase, and potentially if there's something really depleted or ridiculously fragile, it might be enough that the Sentry Flamer could even take out the enemy unit that was scoring or contesting that objective. D6 plus 3 auto hits from a Sentry Flamer should have a good chance to kill maybe 1 or 2 guard equivalents, and in some super close situations, such as trying to deny the opponent doing certain actions or secondaries, or trying to stop a key model taking a primary objective, that could be enough to be game-changing enough to justify the entire commitment. Overall, in general, I certainly think that they're quite strong enough to be going about doing what they're doing with absolutely no support from the rest of the Guard army. Occasionally, though, it might well make sense to help them out with other things. It's certainly possible that you could throw orders at them, maybe coordinate with a Tempestus command squad with Grand Strategist or Gaunt's Ghosts, and that could have the squad have things like hitting on a 2+, getting take cover or extra objective control. You would have to position them properly though, with the one squad doing the 3-inch deep strike and the other squad doing the 9-inch deep strike, and it maybe does feel just a little bit clunky and restrictive on where the Aquilons can set up, plus forcing the other units to play aggressive, but occasionally I guess it could make sense. If it's safe enough to do so, you might well be able to get away with the order. And Tempestus Command Squad I guess could help out with their Master Vox to get it a bit further away. Otherwise, Guard have access to a fairly crazy amount of shooting buffs, a Leman-Russ Exterminator for buffing AP, Fields of Fire for 2 command points for the same, maybe a bit less if you have Creed about, Hellhounds for ignoring cover, and then a Sentinel for reroll 1s to hit. If you had some sort of combination of those focusing on one target, you could have some ridiculously savage hotshots, theoretically all the way up to AP3 ignores cover, hitting on 2s with rerolling 1s to hit. Though in reality, if you're doing some sort of crazy focus combo of buffs like that, it's probably going to be far better off buffing things like, say, Leman-Russ battle tanks or Rogue or Dawn tanks. And I feel like at least a fair bit of the time the Aquilons is being able to hit things that the rest of your army can't see and shoot, so they might not always be able to coordinate with those sort of things. I guess Fields of Fire could be handed out with Creed with a mortar though, I suppose. Otherwise, you could also coordinate with some artillery as well to maybe better wipe out a supposedly safe enemy unit. Plenty of damage from those hot shots and any other supporting stratagems, and then have a bit more damage come in from a Basilisk, mortars, or field ordnance guns or something. Might just slightly expand the scope of what the Aquilons can threaten to wipe out, maybe seeing what their damage does and committing the artillery as a backup if needed. In any case, between all this, they are basically just one of the strongest units in Warhammer 40k right now. It's perhaps no surprise to take a look at the 4 tournament winning guard lists so far since the balance update. It appears that Tempestus Aquilons have featured in literally every single one of them. 2 lists just used the 1 squad, 1 list used 2, and 1 list used 3. Certainly implies that having the utility of at least some of them in the army is absolutely great, though I think maybe there could be a touch of diminishing returns about them. If you have the 1 3-inch deep strike unit, then you have them for the exact time when you need them most. I think personally I'd probably be most tempted to try and aim for 2 units of them, to have them to be able to drop turn 2 and turn 3. Even if they are paying a premium for it, they are competing with other guard deep strikers as well. Gaunt's Ghosts are another fairly godly secondary unit with their return to reserves, and you've also got the option of 50-point Scion squads as well, just to do cheap nuisance deep strike when the 3-inch isn't critical. They'll still be able to drop and do plenty of actions and secondaries just in their own right, and you could have 2 drops of them for each drop of the Aquilons pretty much. In general though, with their absolutely crazy value, it's not surprising that Aquilons seem to be largely auto-including competitive armies along with Lord Solar, and just feel like the sort of unit that's going to give you a solid increase to just being able to mess around with primary and secondary scores. That feels like a very, very direct power boost to the Guard army overall, and might cause the opponent all sorts of headaches if they want to try and stop them doing what they're doing. Overall, between all that, I think they're probably vying for one of the single most undercosted units in Warhammer 40k right now. I don't know if they'd think about changing the rules for them or anything like that, or just cranking up the points cost to quite a big amount. I feel like you could potentially still justify them at a far higher points cost, partly thanks to being able to threaten reinforcements on them. So if the enemy does wipe them out, you might still be able to come round and have another go with them, and still say get 2 3-inch deep strike threats out of the same, say, 150 points or so if they crank them up to that kind of thing. Which I think even then might tempt some people, even if I think in reality a lot of people would leave them on the shelf at that points cost. They just seem like perhaps a slightly hard units to balance right when there's the option to recycle them at the moment. For all their goodness, I feel like if they're playing against someone who really knows exactly what they might be trying to do, there definitely are counters to them. Firstly, to make sure that they don't sneak primaries. If it's an option, then putting things centrally on objectives to screen out the 3-inch deep strike is sensible. And also for the home field objective, don't just leave it solely in the hands of toughness 3 infantry that the Tempestus Aquilons can almost certainly wipe out. Even if you have some of those on there, it makes sense to have something else towing on, maybe just something like a cheap transport vehicle or gun tank, which means that when you drop in and the softer objective holders get wiped out, the objective will still be yours. To some extent, you can still screen 3-inch deep strikers. It's just going to be far more limited what you can do with that compared with the 9-inch ones. Some armies with a fair few big infantry units with a good number of people in them will be able to do that though, just needing to chain out fairly maximally and see where the footprint of the unit could realistically fit in. There are 10 models in the squad with 28mm bases, so they're not just like an individual base assassin or something that's trying to fit in. They do need at least a fair bit of room to drop. It could be very diminishing returns, particularly if your opponent only takes one unit of them as well though, whether or not it's even worth it, or just accept that they're going to drop in and cause problems somewhere and just have the rest of the army trying to do what it's doing and react to them as necessary. Otherwise, I guess Overwatch could potentially put a dent in their numbers. They're probably not going to kill the special weapons or the flamer in the squad, so maybe it isn't going to be too worth it unless the death of every single hotshot is going to be critical. And then when it comes to your turn, you'd have to think about whether or not it actually makes sense to wipe them out or not. If you could deplete the unit and lock them up in close combat, that seems like the best way to deal with them if the opponent's trying to threaten reinforcements for them, or just kill them as quickly as possible if they for some reason happen not to have the command points to do so. In any case though, I feel like while you can make their life significantly harder, there's still going to remain some kind of godly value to the Astra Militarum until the next balance update, where I think that no one would be too surprised if they got a massive points hike when the December thing comes around. And of course we do have the next Astra Militarum Codex on the horizon as well, which could certainly change things as well. In any case though, I'll leave that there for now. Let me know what you make of the scary power of the Tempestus Aquilons, and have you had any games with or against them yet in Warhammer 40k? Look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments as always. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, while I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description down below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.